Every night at 2:17 in the morning, he and his wife hear the bells of St. Mercy's ring. Now, the thing is, where they live in South Dakota, there's no church around. There's especially no church called St. Mercy's. But they moved into their house 4 years ago from Florida for John's job. He said he works in the outdoor space. Not sure exactly what he does, but just an outdoorsy type guy. Where they moved in South Dakota, he said it's like kind of suburban. Everybody has property, but you still have neighbors. They move in. The first night they're there, they hear church bells going off at 2:17 in the morning. They were sitting in the living room. They were still awake, unpacking, when they hear the bells start clanging in the distance. John looks at his wife. He says, I didn't know that there was a church nearby. She says, neither did I. They don't think anything of it. They go to sleep. The next day, their neighbor Betty comes over. She's an older lady. She brings like a pie or cookies, or she's basically just the welcoming committee. She's like, welcome to the neighborhood. Here you go. I'm Betty. John's wife is like, oh, it's so nice to have neighbors that introduce themselves. Like, nowhere that I've ever lived in Florida did people come over and introduce themselves whenever I moved anywhere. And Betty's like, oh yeah, like, you know, anything you need, just let me know. She said her kids are grown. They're out of the house, but she's lived there forever. Betty's like, I think you guys are going to really love it here. Like, it's a great neighborhood. Everybody's really nice. There's a lot of young families because John and his wife didn't have any kids yet, but they were planning on it. Betty says, oh, I encourage you to get to know the neighbors. Like, I know everybody. Everybody's cool. That night, John and his wife stay up again. And at 2:17 in the morning, they hear those church bells again. They both stop. They're like, where is that coming from? And why is it happening at 2:17 in the morning? So they count the chimes, and the bells ring 12 times, and then it stops. He said they weren't like scared. It wasn't eerie. It was just out of place and at a strange time. So the next day, they go to the store to get groceries, and they're like looking around their neighborhood to find this church and where these bells are coming from. They can't find a church. They get home, they're unpacking the car. Betty's in her yard. So John's wife walks over to her and she says, hey, Betty, do you know anything about the bells that go off at 2:17 in the morning? Like, have you ever heard that? And Betty just, her face goes like solemn. And she's like, you can hear the bells? And they're like, yeah. And she's like, yeah, those are the St. Mercy's bells. If you hear them, don't look for them. So they're like, what do you mean don't look for them? And she's like, oh, it's just an old folk tale around here that the St. Mercy's bells go off at 2:17 in the morning, but nobody's actually heard them. And they're like, what do you mean? Like, you don't hear them? And she's like, no, I don't hear bells. So John's wife presses and she's like, well, what do you know about St. Mercy's? Like, was that a church around here? And Betty basically just says that it was a folk tale when her kids were in school, that there were ghostly bells that rang at 2:17 in the morning, but that everybody in the neighborhood just kind of assumed that it was just that, just a folk tale. Betty kind of studies them for a minute and then she kind of laughs. She's like, you guys must be playing a joke on me. You must have heard this folk tale and are trying to tell me that you heard the bells. And they're like, no, we really heard them. And she's like, okay, well, all I know about it is that if you hear them, you're not supposed to go outside and look for them. John said his wife was all freaked out after this. And she was like, that didn't rub me the right way. Like, I don't know what's going on. And he's like, it's nothing. Like, she probably just doesn't know about some church that's here. I guarantee you there's a church and the sound is carrying and that's why we can hear the bells. So that night they're laying in bed and they decide that they're going to stay up until 2:17 to hear the bells. They are laying awake in bed. 2:17 comes and goes and they don't hear the bells. John said he's very scientific minded. He does not believe in the paranormal at all. So when they don't hear the bells at 2:17 in the morning, he looks at his wife and he kind of laughs and he's like, well, I guess the ghosts aren't going to play the bells for us since we heard it and we talked about it. And his wife kind of rolls her eyes at him. She's like, okay, I guess you were right. So she's like, I'm going to go to the kitchen and get a glass of water. So she gets up, she goes to the kitchen and she comes running back in the bedroom and she's like, John, I hear the bells. He's like, you're joking with me. He gets up, he goes into the kitchen and sure enough, he can hear the bells from the kitchen. He said there was only a short hallway from his bedroom to the kitchen. So he should have been able to hear whatever he heard in the kitchen in his bedroom. But when he walked back in the bedroom, he couldn't hear the bells anymore. And they rang the same amount of times, 12. So the bells stop and John's like, I'm going to go outside and figure out where these bells are coming from. And his wife's like, no, she literally told you don't go outside and look for the bells. And he's like, do you really believe this old batty woman next door? And she's like, I guess you're right. So he goes outside. He doesn't hear anything, doesn't see anything. And he comes back and he's like, there's nothing there. I guarantee you it's a church in the distance. Fast forward a year. They're still living in the house. They can still hear the church bells every night ring at 2:17 in the morning, exactly 12 times, and then it stops. They chalk this up to a church in the distance that they just haven't found yet. They can only hear the bells when they're in the kitchen or the living room. They can't hear it from the bedrooms or the bathroom. And John just assumes that this is something with the way that the sound carries in the house. They get used to it. His wife actually even starts to like it. He said she's a religious woman and she finds it peaceful. He said they both tried to do a little bit of research, asked around the town. Some people heard about the bells but never heard them themselves, but they don't really think anything of it. His wife gets pregnant. They're expecting a new little baby girl. She's 6 months pregnant and a new family moves in across the street named the Baxters. It's a dad named Dan, a wife, and then they have 2 small children. After the Baxters move in, John, his wife, and Betty all go over there, introduce themselves, and they're excited that there's a new young family on the street and they think that they can all be friends. One day, John's outside doing yard work. He sees men across the street doing yard work and their little boys playing in the garden. John walks across the street to talk to Dan, the dad, and they're just kind of talking when their little boy runs over and he said, look what I found in the garden. He finds this antique coin. Neither of the 2 men had ever seen a coin like that, but they look it up online and they realize it's worth thousands. And they're like, this was an amazing find. Good job, little buddy. That night, John is up watching TV in his living room. He's got the blinds open and 2:17 comes around. His wife is already asleep. He hears the bells. He happens to see a light flicker out of the corner of his eye. So he looks outside and sees that the Baxter's porch light goes on. And Dan, the dad, comes outside and stands on the lawn and looks up at the sky. So So John's like, no way, like he hears the bells. So he walks outside and the bells are still going in the distance. He walks up to Dan and he's like, hey man, like, do you hear that? Dan does not break eye contact with this guy, doesn't even acknowledge John. John said the air felt heavy, like right before lightning strike when it's about to storm, but it was a clear night. And the bells are going dong, dong, dong. And Dan is just still staring at the sky when a huge shadow, he said it must have been something massive, passes over them and darkens even the street light. So John looks up at the sky and there's nothing there. Then the bells stop, the shadow disappears. He looks back at Dan. Dan looks at him. They lock eyes. And then Dan just collapses onto the lawn. John thought he had a heart attack. So he gets down in the grass. He's like, oh my God, man, are you okay? Like, he's shaking him. He said his eyes were open. He was breathing, but he just wasn't there. So he puts him back down gently in the grass. He runs to the door. He bangs on the door. Dan's wife comes and he's like, call an ambulance. I don't know what happened to him. He just collapsed. The ambulance comes. They take him away. He comes home the next day. He's fine. But Dan changed after that. John and his wife went over there a few times to see if they needed anything. And Dan's wife just said, he's not the same. I don't know what's going on with him. I think he's experiencing like a depressive episode. Like he's just not the same. He never wanted company. He became kind of a recluse. Recluse. He stopped going to work. He had an electrical company with a big van that was always parked in their driveway when he was home. It had the logo on the side. So they knew when he was going to work and when he was home. That van just started staying parked in the driveway. John's wife kept calling Dan's wife just to see if she could do anything for them. And one day his wife just says, I'm going to take the kids and go stay with my parents for a little while until he gets better. I don't know what's going on with him. I can't stand to be around him anymore. But he never got better. They would often see him standing in his bathrobe on the front lawn at 2:17 in the morning. A few times John went out to try to get him back inside and he just stared at the sky. One night, John looks out there and he sees him out there talking to himself. He walks up, he thinks he's on the phone, and he's talking into the phone, and he says, Dan, who are you talking to? And Dan's just still talking, and he's just mumbling. He's not even saying words. So John grabs the phone from him, and he sees he's not talking to anyone. Sometime after that, I don't know how much time passed, but he said it was just before his wife gave birth to their daughter, so it must have been a few months. He wakes up and he sees there's all this junk on the front lawn. Like Dan had just pulled everything out of their house, including the refrigerator, and threw it all over the front lawn. Betty sees it. She comes out of her house. She's like, are they moving? John's like, I'm going to go check on him. So he goes and knocks on the door. He opens the door because Dan doesn't come to the door and he's calling inside. And he's like, Dan, are you in here? Like he said, he walked in and saw Dan just sitting in his armchair mumbling to himself. Betty was in the doorway and she was just shaking her head. She said, something happened to him. He's not right. So John tells his wife, like, you need to call Dan's wife and tell her to come home and check on him because he is not well. She calls Dan's wife and she basically tells her that, and like, you need to come home. You need to check on him. She comes home the next day. She leaves the kids at her parents' house. She's trying to check on Dan. She ends up coming over to John and his wife's house and just tells them, like, I don't know what's going on with him. I don't know what to do. She said, I'm going to go back over there tonight and see if I can get him some help. That night at 2:17 in the morning, John is awake. He's in the kitchen when he hears the bells, and then there's banging on his door. He opens the door, and it's Dan. John says, what are you doing here? And Dan says, please let me in. And he hears the church bells going in the distance. And John says, please let me in. And Dan says, no, you need to go home. Your wife is over there. She's trying to work it out with you. Dan, you need to go home. And Dan looks at him and says, there's no Dan anymore. So John puts his arm around Dan. They're walking back across the street when all of a sudden Dan stops and looks straight up into the sky and he says, it's back. John said he got chills because when he said that, all of the street lights darkened again and it was like a shadow cast over the entire neighborhood. The bells stopped and Dan was trembling in John's arms. He took him back to the house and eventually the Baxters moved. He said after that night, Dan's wife stopped returning John's wife's calls, and they never found out what happened to the family. A few months after that, they were talking to Betty in the garden, and Betty was like, yeah, it's just such a shame what happened to that family. John said, yeah, I think he had a mental break after he had that minor heart attack. And Betty said, I should have told him not to look for the bells. Now, I've done research, and I can't find anything about the St. Mercy's bells. So if you're from South Dakota, if you've heard of this, let me know in the comments. John said that he still believes that it was nothing paranormal. He can't explain the shadow that he saw or the bells because they never did find that church. But he said he's open to other theories, so if you have any thoughts for him, let him know. He'll be seeing these comments. His name is the same, but Dan and the Baxter's names have been changed for this story. Keep sending me your spooky, scary stories.